He does not walk onto the stage asking for approval. He does not ask to be liked. And he certainly does not ask to be protected from criticism. Instead, Louis Farrakhan opens with a challenge that instantly changes the rules of engagement. Judge me only on whether what I say is true, not on whether it makes you uncomfortable, not on whether it disrupts the status quo, only on truth. That single demand is what made this speech impossible to ignore and impossible to contain. Farrakhan presents himself as independent of political power, free from party loyalty, donors, or ambition for office. In doing so, he places himself outside the usual mechanisms that tame public figures. He frames truth as something that does not negotiate, does not soften itself, and does not seek validation from institutions. This is the foundation of everything that follows. From the very beginning, the speech signals that it will not offer easy reassurance. It questions long-held assumptions, challenges systems many consider settled, and forces listeners to confront ideas they may prefer to avoid. Farrakhan's tone is not casual. It is deliberate, confrontational, and rooted in moral conviction. Whether one agrees with him or not, the structure of his opening makes one thing clear: this is not entertainment, it is a declaration. That is precisely why the speech drew intense reactions. Words framed as truth claims carry a different weight. They demand response, not dismissal. They provoke debate rather than passive consumption. And when such words come from someone already viewed as controversial, the result is friction, social, political, and cultural. In this video, we explore why this opening mattered, how it set the tone for everything that followed, and why many believed it crossed lines others were unwilling to approach. If you value deep analysis, historical context, and conversations that go beyond surface-level narratives, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. What you're about to hear isn't meant to be comfortable, it's meant to be examined. After establishing himself as a man uninterested in political favor or public approval, Farrakhan moves naturally into the consequence of that position. If truth is his only currency, he argues, then opposition is not only expected, it is inevitable. He frames the bans, media exclusions, and travel restrictions not as isolated incidents or misunderstandings, but as a pattern that reveals how power reacts when challenged outside its rules. In his telling, debate was never offered because debate requires engagement, and engagement grants legitimacy. Silence, by contrast, removes oxygen. He recounts moments when doors closed without explanation, when platforms that claimed to value free expression suddenly found reasons to withdraw invitations. Television networks declined to host him, not after contentious exchanges, but before they could occur. He describes airports where his movement was restricted, hotels where reservations vanished once his identity was known, and countries where entry became conditional or impossible. These experiences are woven into the narrative not as personal grievances, but as evidence that his message reached beyond a single audience and unsettled institutions accustomed to controlling discourse. What makes this argument compelling is the way it connects back to his opening claim. By placing himself outside formal politics, Farrakhan also removes the usual incentives for compromise. There is no office to lose, no campaign to protect, no coalition to preserve. In that vacuum, he suggests, power has only two options: confront the message openly, or prevent it from circulating. According to him, the choice was rarely confrontation. Instead, it was exclusion disguised as responsibility, restriction justified as caution, and silence framed as protection of public order. The story he tells is not one of sudden repression, but gradual narrowing. Invitations grow fewer, travel becomes complicated, media references shift from engagement to warning. Over time, the message does not disappear, but it is pushed to the margins, where it can be labeled without being heard. Farrakhan presents this process as more effective than censorship by force, because it preserves the appearance of openness while quietly enforcing boundaries. The audience is left to ask whether ideas are being rejected because they are false, or because they are disruptive. This is where the narrative tightens. Farrakhan does not claim that all opposition proves he is right. Instead, he argues that refusal to debate reveals fear of the discussion itself. In his view, Truth does not require protection from scrutiny. It survives it. What requires protection, he implies, are systems built on fragile assumptions. By denying him space, his critics avoid legitimizing questions they would rather remain unanswered. The power of this section of the story lies in its restraint. He does not describe himself as defeated or silenced, but as redirected. If official channels are closed, he speaks elsewhere. If borders restrict him, his words travel without him. Each obstacle becomes part of the testimony, reinforcing the idea that resistance confirms relevance. The more difficult it becomes to speak, the more significant the speech appears to those who seek it out. By linking exclusion to institutional discomfort rather than personal persecution, Farrakhan maintains the moral consistency of his opening stance. He is not asking for sympathy. He is asking for examination. If his ideas are wrong, he insists, expose them through argument. If they are dangerous, explain why. But if the response is avoidance, then the silence itself becomes part of the story, a story not just about one man, but about how societies decide which truths are permitted to be heard and which are deemed too unsettling to debate. From the moment Farrakhan frames himself as a man accountable only to truth, the direction of his critique becomes unavoidable. If institutions silence him, he asks a deeper question. Who among his own people has learned to live comfortably within those institutions? This is where his message turns inward, and where it becomes most unsettling, because it is no longer about external power alone, but about internal consent. He speaks of black elites not as symbols of progress, but as evidence of a deeper contradiction. Education, wealth, and access, he argues, have too often come at the price of alignment. Degrees are earned, positions secured, visibility granted, yet the conditions of the masses remain largely unchanged. In his storytelling, success becomes suspect when it requires silence about injustice. The issue is not achievement itself, but the purpose it serves. He challenges the idea that proximity to power equals liberation, suggesting instead that it can become another form of dependence, polished and normalized. This critique extends into personal life, where Farrakhan uses relationships as a metaphor for collective identity. When he speaks about interracial relationships, he is not merely commenting on romance, but on symbolism. To him, these unions represent unresolved history, wounds covered rather than healed. He frames them as questions rather than conclusions. What does it mean to seek belonging with those tied, historically, to domination, while collective trauma remains unaddressed? In his narrative, the discomfort of that question is precisely the point. He is not asking listeners to accept his answer easily, but to confront the emotional and historical weight behind their choices. Dependence on white institutions becomes the thread that ties these critiques together. Farrakhan describes schools, churches, political systems, and economic structures not as neutral tools, but as frameworks built without black autonomy at their center. To rely on them exclusively, he argues, is to accept their limits as permanent. His language here is careful in its logic. One cannot expect freedom to be delivered by systems that were never designed to produce it. This is not framed as resentment, but as realism born of experience. What makes this section of the story resonate is how it connects back to his own marginalization. Just as institutions refuse to debate him openly, he suggests that many black leaders refuse to challenge the foundations of their own acceptance. Silence, again, becomes a form of agreement. In this light, separation is not presented as hatred or rejection, but as recovery, a pause, a step back to rebuild identity, values, and purpose without external validation. Farrakhan's call for black self-respect is therefore not abstract. It is practical and psychological. He speaks of knowing one's history, defining success internally, and building structures that serve community needs rather than symbolic inclusion. Unity, in his telling, is not sameness, but shared direction. Without it, advancement becomes fragmented, and power remains borrowed rather than owned. The storytelling here is intentionally uncomfortable because it refuses to offer a comforting resolution. Farrakhan does not promise immediate harmony or universal agreement. Instead, he presents separation as a phase of self-definition, a necessary condition for dignity rather than an end in itself. Whether one accepts this vision or rejects it, Its coherence is undeniable. It grows directly from his opening premise. If truth matters more than approval, then criticism must begin at home as much as it confronts the outside world. In weaving together elite complicity, personal choices, and institutional dependence, Farrakhan forces the listener to grapple with a hard idea that liberation cannot be outsourced. And it is this insistence, more than any single statement, that explains why his words continue to provoke, unsettle, and divide long after the speech itself was pushed beyond the margins. As Farrakhan's critique turns from social structures to spiritual foundations, the story deepens rather than shifts. Having questioned political power and internal dependency, he moves into the realm that shapes meaning itself, religion. Here, he does not speak as a theologian seeking consensus, but as a narrator challenging the origin story many have been taught to accept without examination. His argument is not aimed at faith as belief, but at faith as inheritance, specifically, how belief systems can be shaped by history, power, and circumstance. So here, he frames Christianity as it was historically presented to enslaved Africans in America, not as a liberating force, but as a tool of control. In his telling, religion did not arrive in chains by accident. It was packaged, translated, and emphasized in ways that encouraged obedience, patience, and acceptance of suffering in exchange for distant reward. Farrakhan does not deny the spiritual depth many find in Christian practice. Instead, he questions the version of it that was promoted under bondage. The issue, he argues, is not God, but the narrative about God that was permitted to survive. This argument ties directly back to his earlier insistence on truth over comfort. Just as political institutions resist scrutiny, so too do sacred narratives when they are intertwined with identity. Farrakhan suggests that when faith is inherited through trauma, it deserves to be examined rather than assumed to be neutral. His challenge is psychological as much as spiritual. How does a people understand themselves if their image of the divine reflects the face of those who once held absolute power over them? To expand this point, he turns to biblical imagery, not to dismiss scripture, but to reinterpret it. He invokes the language of empires, captivity, and judgment, drawing parallels between ancient civilizations described in religious texts and modern America. In this framework, America is not portrayed simply as a nation, but as an idea powerful, prosperous, and outwardly confident, yet inwardly conflicted like the great empires of old. It is depicted as believing itself immune to consequence, untouched by the destruction it has imposed elsewhere. The imagery is deliberate. Farrakhan describes a society rich in symbols of freedom while struggling with unresolved injustice. He speaks of a land filled with abundance, yet marked by confusion, division, and moral contradiction. The biblical references function as mirrors rather than weapons, inviting listeners to see patterns repeated across time. Empires rise, justify themselves, and often fail to recognize their own fragility until the moment of reckoning arrives. What makes this section resonate within the larger narrative is its consistency. Farrakhan is not rejecting belief, he is rejecting passivity. Just as he criticized reliance on political and economic systems not designed for liberation, he challenges spiritual frameworks that discourage self-knowledge. Faith, in his vision, must empower dignity, responsibility, and awareness, rather than soothe pain without addressing its source. Religion that cannot confront injustice, he implies, risks becoming another institution that asks the oppressed to endure rather than transform. This is also where his storytelling becomes most symbolic. Judgment, in his language, is not merely punishment from above, but consequence unfolding over time. Societies that ignore inequality, suppress honest dialogue, and confuse dominance with righteousness eventually face internal decay. The warning is not delivered with celebration, but with solemn inevitability. History, like scripture, records patterns whether people acknowledge them or not. By placing America within a biblical arc, Farrakhan aligns his message with something larger than contemporary politics. He suggests that moral accountability transcends eras, cultures, and borders. In doing so, he reinforces his opening claim that his concern is not popularity, but alignment with what he understands as truth. Whether one accepts his interpretation or not, the narrative achieves coherence, political exclusion, social dependency, tibisindi, and spiritual inheritance all become chapters in the same story, a story about power, identity, and the cost of avoiding difficult questions. It is this fusion of history, belief, and moral warning that elevates the speech beyond commentary and into mythic storytelling. Farrakhan is not simply criticizing a nation or a religion. He is challenging listeners to reconsider the frameworks through which they understand freedom, responsibility, Soviet, and themselves. Having challenged political exclusion, internal dependency, and inherited belief systems, Farrakhan turns to what he considers the most concrete evidence of failure: numbers that refuse to disappear. At this point in the story, the argument is no longer symbolic or theological. It becomes measurable. He anchors his claims in history, commissions, and statistics, insisting that inequality is not a matter of perception, but of record. He points to government-commissioned studies, most notably the Kerner Commission, as proof that the problem has long been diagnosed but never treated. Decades earlier, that commission concluded that America was moving toward two separate societies, unequal in opportunity and outcome. Farrakhan revisits those findings not as ancient history, but as a benchmark against which progress can be judged. When later reviews showed conditions had stagnated or worsened for large segments of black communities, he frames it as evidence that neglect was not accidental. Recommendations were written, archived, and ultimately ignored. This is where his demand for reparations emerges, not as a slogan, but as a logical extension of accountability. Farrakhan does not describe reparations as charity or punishment, but as settlement. He compares it to precedents already accepted by the same government when harm was acknowledged and responsibility assigned. In his narrative, unpaid labor, exclusion from wealth-building systems, and generations of enforced disadvantage created a debt that did not vanish with time. Ignoring that debt, he argues, simply allowed inequality to compound. What distinguishes this part of the story is how tightly it connects economics to dignity. Farrakhan does not frame poverty as moral failure, nor success as proof of fairness. Instead, he speaks of structural conditions that shape outcomes regardless of effort. Tax contributions made without equal return, labor given without proportional reward, and loyalty demanded without protection become recurring themes. The result, he suggests, is a population asked to participate fully in a system that has never fully invested in them. From here, the argument moves naturally towards self-determined economic development. If reliance on external institutions has produced consistent imbalance, then waiting for rescue becomes irrational. Farrakhan calls for building economic structures that serve community priorities, retain value internally, and reduce vulnerability to political shifts. This is not presented as isolation, but as insulation, a way to stabilize progress rather than chase approval. Throughout this section, his tone remains accusatory but controlled. He does not deny the presence of black professionals, businesses, or political figures. Instead, he questions scale and impact, individual success. Commithium's classes, he argues, cannot substitute for collective security. When entire communities remain exposed to instability despite visible examples of advancement, something deeper remains unresolved. What gives this argument narrative power is its continuity with everything that came before. Political exclusion explains why debate is avoided. Internal dependency explains why access does not translate into transformation. Spiritual inheritance explains why endurance is often mistaken for virtue. Economic data, then, becomes the ledger that confirms the cost of all three. Numbers, unlike rhetoric, do not bend to intention. Farrakhan's insistence on reparations is therefore less about the past than about the future. He frames it as a reset, a chance to correct imbalance so that development can proceed on fair ground. Without that correction, he warns, inequality simply regenerates under new language and new leadership. Progress appears, but only at the surface. By grounding his message in documented history and measurable outcomes, Farrakhan attempts to close the gap between moral argument and material reality. Whether one agrees with his conclusions or not, the structure of the case is difficult to dismiss. It is not built on anger alone, but on accumulation of data, of broken promises, and of unresolved consequences. In the larger story, this moment marks a shift from warning to demand, from interpretation to insistence, making clear that empowerment, in his vision, must be financed as well as affirmed. By the time Farrakhan reaches the end of his message, the divide around him is fully visible. To his supporters, he stands as a fearless voiceomeon willing to say what others avoid, to confront power without apology, and to speak directly to a community he believes has been taught to doubt its own worth. They hear in his words a call to unity, discipline, responsibility, savior, and self-definition. For them, his refusal to soften his message is not recklessness, but integrity. In a world shaped by compromise and careful language, his certainty feels rare, even necessary. So, to his critics, however, that same certainty is precisely the problem. They argue that his language draws lines too sharply, that his framing of history and identity risks deepening division rather than healing it. Where supporters hear empowerment, critics hear exclusion. Where some hear moral urgency, others hear rhetoric that oversimplifies complex realities. This tension between intention and impact, between conviction and consequences, what ultimately explains why the speech became so controversial, and why it was pushed out of mainstream circulation. What makes this moment significant is not simply that a speech was restricted, but what that restriction represents. Farrakhan's message forces uncomfortable questions into the open. Who gets to define acceptable discourse? When does protection of social harmony become avoidance of hard truths? And who decides whether a voice is too dangerous to be heard, rather than too challenging to be engaged? The banning of the speech does not settle these questions, it amplifies them. In many ways, Farrakhan becomes a symbol rather than just a speaker. To some, he symbolizes resistance to erasure and a refusal to dilute historical memory. To others, he symbolizes the risks of absolutism in a pluralistic society. Both interpretations coexist, and neither can fully erase the other. That unresolved tension is why his words continue to circulate long after official platforms withdrew. The story, then, is larger than one man or one speech. It is about how societies negotiate the boundary between expression and responsibility, between critique and cohesion. Farrakhan's supporters argue that progress has never come from silence, and that unity without honesty is fragile. His critics argue that language carries consequences, and that rhetoric, however passionately intended, can harden divisions it seeks to address. Between these positions lies the reality that difficult conversations rarely arrive without cost. Perhaps that is why this speech endures, not because it offers easy answers, but because it exposes the fractures beneath familiar narratives. It asks listeners to confront history, power, belief, and identity without the comfort of neutrality. Whether one agrees or disagrees, the speech demands engagement, and that demand alone makes it disruptive. As this story comes to a close, the question is not simply whether Farrakhan was right or wrong, but what it means when a society chooses silence over debate. If you found this analysis thoughtful and worth exploring further, thank you for spending your time here. Be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future deep dives into history, power, and the stories that continue to shape our world.